Donald Trump's anti-press rhetoric is very close to incitement to violence that would lead to journalists censoring themselves or being attacked, the outgoing UN Human Rights Commissioner has said. Zaid Raad al-Hussein, a Jordanian prince and diplomat, is stepping down this month as UN High Commissioner for Human Rights after deciding not to stand for a second four-year term, in the face of a waning commitment among world powers to fighting abuses. Zaid said the Trump administration's lack of concern about human rights marked a distinct break with previous administrations, and that Trump's own rhetoric aimed at minorities and at the press was redolent of two of the worst eras of the 20th century, the run-up to the two world wars. In an interview with The Guardian, he singled out the U.S. president's repeated designation of the press as the enemy of the people. We began to see a campaign against the media that could have potentially, and still can, set in motion a chain of events which could quite easily lead to harm being inflicted on journalists just going about their work and potentially some self-censorship, Zaid said. And in that context, it's getting very close to incitement to violence, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights Zaid Raad al-Hussein. Photograph, Henry Romero, Reuters. He said it would be up to a court to determine whether Trump was actually guilty of incitement depending on the circumstances, if, say, a journalist was stabbed while covering a rally. He said Trump's example was already being followed elsewhere, giving license to authoritarian leaders to crack down on the media in ways they had not previously dared to. Zaid pointed to the Cambodian leader, Hun Sen, who he said had used similar language when he closed down independent media organizations. In the 20th century, feelings were stoked, directed at a vulnerable group for the sake of political gain. Zaid Raad al-Hussein, the U.S. creates a demonstration effect, which then is picked up by other countries where the leadership tends to be more authoritarian in character or aspires to be authoritarian, he said. Zaid has also taken on the Trump administration over its policy of separating children from their parents in migrant families arrested at the border, and Trump's own long history of rhetoric aimed at minorities. When language is used in a way that focuses on groups of people who have traditionally suffered a great deal from bigotry and prejudice and chauvinism, it harked back to a period not too long ago in the 20th century when feelings were stoked, directed at a vulnerable group for the sake of political gain, he said, adding that he was referring in particular to the 1930s and the period before the First World War. Zaid began his tenure as UN Human Rights Commissioner in 2014 during the Obama administration and said his contacts with the State Department dropped off significantly after Trump took office in January 2017. A Syrian regime airstrike on the besieged eastern Ghouta region of its capital, Damascus, in February. Zaid has criticized the catastrophic failure of the UN Security Council to halt mass killings in Syria. Photograph, Mr. Suleiman, AFP, Getty. The Trump administration seems to have separated itself from previous administrations in its upholding of human rights globally, Zaid said. The administration's failure to appoint an ambassador to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, before withdrawing from the council altogether, he added, was illustrative of the lack of any deep commitment to the human rights. Timeline: March 2011. Unprecedented protests demand civil liberties and the release of political prisoners after 4 decades of repressive rule by the Assad family. The regime represses demonstrations in Damascus and the southern city of Darabak. Protests continue. July 2011. Defecting Army Colonel Riyad al-Assad sets up the Turkey-based rebel Free Syrian Army. Islamist groups join the revolt. March 2012. Regime forces take control of the rebel stronghold in Homs after a month of bombardment. Other bloody operations are carried out, notably in the central city of Hama, after massive anti-regime protests. July 2012. FSA fighters launch a battle for Damascus but the government holds firm. August 2013. More than 1,400 people die in a chemical weapon attack on rebel-held districts near Damascus. September 2013. The U.S. and Assad ally Russia agree a plan to eliminate Syria's chemical weapons, averting punitive U.S. strikes against the regime. January 2014. Hostilities between jihadists and rebel groups turn into an open war in the north. The group that will become known as Islamic State takes Raqqa, the first provincial capital to fall out of regime control, from rebel forces. September 2014, a U.S.-led coalition launches airstrikes against ISIS in Syria. The strikes benefit Kurdish groups, which since 2013 have run autonomous administrations in Kurdish-majority areas. September 2015, Russia launches airstrikes in support of Assad's troops, who are on the back foot. Russian firepower helps turn the tables for the regime, which begins to retake rebel-held territory. December 2016, the regime retakes Syria's second city, Aleppo. January 2017, Russia and Iran, as backers of the Syrian regime, and Turkey, a supporter of the rebels, organize talks in Kazakhstan, between representatives of both sides. The process leads to the creation of 4 de-escalation zones. April 2017, a sarin gas attack on the rebel-held town of Khan Sheikhan kills more than 80 people, prompting Washington to attack a regime airbase. January 2018, further complicating an already drawn-out conflict, Turkey launches an operation against the Kurdish People's Protection Units which, with U.S. support, played a key role in beating back ISIS. February 2018, regime launches a ferocious assault on the remaining rebel-held enclave near Damascus, eastern Ghouta. In under 4 weeks, the Russian-backed onslaught kills more than 1,200 civilians. Thank you for your feedback. Zaid has been an outspoken critic of governments around the world for their human rights records, but his tenure as High Commissioner has coincided with the catastrophic failure of the UN Security Council to halt mass killings in Syria or Yemen, and the relegation of human rights as a priority at the UN in general, where it accounts for just 3% of overall spending. A pivotal moment came in March when Zaid was blocked from even addressing the Security Council on human rights in Syria, where more than 500,000 people have been killed in 7 years of violence. Russia and China were adamantly opposed, but the French delegation was confident it had the 9 votes necessary for the session to go ahead. The late Ivory Coast ambassador to the United Nations Bernard Tana Boutoué, previously posted in Russia, died 1 month after a last-minute change to his vote that then vetoed a Security Council meeting to discuss the war in Syria. Photographed Alamy, however, with less than a minute to go and Zaid primed to speak, the ambassador from the Ivory Coast informed his French counterpart he had changed his mind and would abstain. The session was called off. The Ivorian government insisted that its diplomat, Bernard Tana Boutoué, had acted without its permission. Western diplomats became convinced that Tana Boutoué, who had previously served as ambassador to Moscow, had come under pressure from Russia to switch his vote, but the mystery was never resolved. The 67-year-old diplomat died in New York of a sudden illness, said to be a heart attack, a month after his controversial abstention. Zaid said he never understood the machinations behind the vote, but said it reflected a broader trend. I would be very suspicious of any commissioner seeking a second term because I'd wonder what deals are being struck. Zaid Raad al-Hussein, it tells me more about the weakening influence of the Western powers that they could not secure 9 votes for a briefing on human rights in Syria, he said. If you are discussing Syria in the Security Council and you are not discussing gross human rights violations, what are you discussing? The latest arts and crafts fair in Damascus. It's ridiculous. Zaid's has often been a lonely voice. Hopes that the current Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, would be more outspoken on human rights than his predecessor, have been dashed, a Western diplomat at the UN said. There is a complete separation of what Zaid said and what the Secretary General says, and his impact has been reduced because of that, the diplomat said. And there a broader problem of the ability of human rights abuses to shock and lead to a change of policy. That link has been broken. Actors who should have listened to Zaid, have not. Zaid said he came to the decision early on in his tenure to speak out on human rights abuses irrespective of the political circumstances. He attributed his approach in part to his first major foreign mission as a UN official in his early 30s, when he witnessed first-hand UN dithering and timidity during the fall of the Muslim enclave of Srebrenica, and the subsequent slaughter of some 8,000 men and boys by Bosnian Serb troops. Bosnian Muslim women pray near the coffin of a relative, one of 520 newly identified victims of the massacres at Srebrenica of Muslim men and boys. Photograph, Amel Emmerich, AP. We felt that there were periods of silence and that was painful for the UN, and the UN was not respected ultimately by the parties to the conflict, and therefore we saw the disasters that came from it, Zaid said. And, if the UN is not respected, the UN is rolled over to my mind. You don't earn anyone's respect by being silent. Zaid's advice to his successor, Michelle Bachelet, who has been both a political prisoner and president in her native Chile, is to stay courageous and not to run for a second term. I would be very suspicious of any commissioner seeking a second term because I'd wonder what deals are being struck, and if they've been struck on the back of victims, he said. The job of bearing witness to crimes against humanity also takes an emotional toll. Zaid recalled a trip to Mexico to speak to the families of 43 students who were abducted and presumed murdered by a criminal gang in 2014. I was listening to mothers and fathers, siblings, speak of those who were disappeared and presumably killed. After that, I had a series of interviews and I wasn't in the right emotional state to actually give the interview because there was something deep within me where I felt I was a fraud, Zaid said. That given the enormity, the colossal nature of their suffering, with us they wanted salvation, they want an end to suffering. They want us to do something that is in many respects almost impossible to do. That is where most of the pressure comes from in this job.